Good afternoon. I am J.J. Im, a professor of medicine at Seoul National University College of Medicine, and the leader of the pandemic research cluster at the Institute for Future Strategy, Seoul National University. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our fifth lecture series featuring eminent invited speakers. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Jerome Kim, the Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, as our distinguished speaker. Let me introduce him briefly. Dr. Kim is a graduate of the University of Hawaii with majors in history and biology, and he earned his MD from the Yale University School of Medicine. Then Dr. Kim completed his internal medicine residency and infectious disease fellowship at Duke University Medical Center. With over 300 publications and numerous awards, Dr. Kim's contributions to the field of medicine are truly remarkable. Currently, Dr. Kim is on a journey in Rwanda, furthering his devotion. The title of today's talk is Lessons from Pandemic Vaccine Development from COVID-19 to Other Pandemic Pathogens. Dr. Kim, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Professor Yim. And I am sorry that I'm not there to give this talk in person, but there were some sudden changes in the itinerary and I had to divert to several different African countries. So I apologize, but I'm very excited to be able to speak at the in this lecture series with all the other eminent speakers. Now I'm going to advance here. Nope. There we go. So this is just a brief description of the International Vaccine Institute. Those of you who went to Seoul National University, if you go out the back gate and turn right, where the Samsung and LG research units are, IVI is the first building on the right. We are a UN-chartered international organization, so we have member states with a mission to discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines for global health. If you look on the right in the box here, you see what we do under discovery, development, and delivery, and then epidemiology and surveillance, because if you work on the diseases that we work on, that is they're called the neglected tropical diseases or the poverty-associated infectious diseases, we often don't have good data on the burden of the disease. And so epidemiology is very important to justify the work that we do. What you see in the light blue are the things that the 256 people at IVI do every day. And if you looked at this, we look a little bit like a research institute under discovery. We look a little bit like a product development partnership or biotech company under development. And then under delivery, we look like a global health organization that, that is delivering vaccines to prevent fatal infectious diseases. But in fact, we're under delivery, we are actually collecting more data that will inform policy. So providing information to ministries of health on the cost effectiveness of vaccines that allow them to justify the use of a vaccine in public health campaigns. What you see in the bottom left-hand corner are the places where IVI works, the headquarters in Seoul, the regional office in Sweden, a country office which will soon officially open in Austria. And then what's not shown here is that we will soon open a regional office in Africa that will support work towards sustainable manufacturing of vaccines in the continent, in Africa. This has not been updated yet. IVI now has 44 member countries and WHO as state parties. So moving on then to the lessons from COVID-19. One of the key elements in the response to COVID and the development of COVID vaccines was innovation. We had our first ever mRNA vaccines, our first use of certain new adjuvants, our first ever development of a DNA vaccine approved in India. So all of these things happened, and they happened very quickly. So the crisis spurred innovation. I think that's lesson number one. The appearance of COVID led to the publication of the sequence by Chinese researchers in the first week of January. By the end of January, CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, that's their abbreviation there, issued the first in a series of grants to 5 different organizations, not all of them were companies, for the development of vaccines against COVID-19. By April, the first vaccines were in human clinical testing. And that is an unprecedented speed for the development of vaccines. And as you know, within 11 months, the vaccines were approved for emergency use. Again, a remarkable journey. So crisis spurred innovation in the development of new vaccines, in the testing of new products, in regulatory pathways that allowed us to get rapid approval of vaccines. You can see here the time between for the development of vaccines when the pathogen was discovered. So this is the Salmonella typhi, the cause of typhoid fever, and the date at which the vaccine was approved in the US. So 100 years for typhoid. This is COVID. So you can see how the innovation was critical. This is Ebola, which is something that I think many of you will remember from 2015. Outbreaks have continued to occur, but Ebola was discovered in about 1977. And Peter Piot, who was an integral part of the team that helped to discover it, actually is going to be given the IBI award, the IBI SK Bioscience Manhun Park Award in April, and he'll give some talks at IBI, and you're all welcome to come and hear them. He's a brilliant speaker. So lesson number 2 here is that you couldn't translate that innovation into something practical, into impact, unless we were funded. And this gets to a key element. If you look during COVID, governments invested huge amounts of money. So these are billions of US dollars. So the European Union, about $23 billion, which I think is 23 or maybe around 28 trillion won. This is the US investment in Operation Warp Speed, which arguably did a tremendous job in pushing forward the mRNA vaccines to rapid approval in the United States, so that by November of 2020, we had vaccines approved for emergency use. Now, here are the companies, and you can see how much funding they received from Operation Warp Speed. Again, this was not cheap, but the development of modalities that would protect against the consequences of COVID-19 infection. Now, remember, the vaccines don't actually do that great a job after about month 3 at preventing infection, but they do provide tremendous protection against the consequences of COVID-19 infection, that is COVID disease, hospitalization and death. So again, a tremendous amount was invested. And I think that is an important lesson. I mean, and a lesson Korea has learned as well, as it's developed its own advanced agency for vaccine development. If you want to develop a pandemic pathogen vaccine quickly, you need to put funding on it in order to encourage companies to do it. Companies are not all going to jump and make a vaccine on their own, which is the traditional model, because for many of them, developing a vaccine against Ebola is not a high priority and is not going to be a source of shareholder value, which if you're in a private company, really matters. So lesson number 3, you know, in the past, when we looked at the vaccines that are manufactured around the world, we have influenza vaccine, and about 500 million doses are manufactured in a standard year of influenza vaccine. And it's one of the most widely produced vaccines. Maybe 24 companies, maybe 23 or 24 companies make influenza vaccine around the world. Now, remember that when we have 7 billion people and we need 2 doses, we're talking 14 billion doses of vaccine. Did we even have the manufacturing capability to do that? Well, it turns out that we made about 13 billion doses of vaccine in the year 2021. So we can scale to billions of doses, and you can see the different capacities of the different manufacturing of different vaccines. And this was in mid-2021. And you can see here how we went from 0 to 11.2 billion doses by the end of the year. Really remarkable production of vaccine. Now, needless to say, equity was a more difficult thing. So what you see in the map here is the use of different vaccines in January of 2021. So remember, the vaccines were approved in November. By January 2021, some of the countries had started to vaccinate. And at that point, about less than 50% of many of the countries that had started to vaccinate were done with vaccination. By 1 year later, you can see that a number of parts of the world, 100% of the population had received at least a single dose of COVID-19 vaccines. But you're starting to see a pattern here in Africa. Maybe I can get the pointer to work. Yes, you notice here in Africa that vaccine usage is not very high at all. 1 year into vaccination, after we've made 11 billion doses, for some reason there's no equity in the distribution around the world. So if you look at the next year, so by January of 2023, again, much of the world has received more than 1 dose. Part of the world is still trying to catch up. And in fact, 30% of, 70% of people in low and middle income countries yet have not received a single dose. Now, they're protected because waves of COVID-19, the Delta wave, the Omicron wave, and now the JN1 wave have swept through these areas. So they've acquired immunity naturally. What does that mean? It means that people at risk for disease who haven't been infected before, that is, who are naive to infection, are going to have very significant rates of disease, morbidity, mortality, hospitalization, and death, if they can even get to a hospital, because in many parts of the world, healthcare delivery is still an issue. And what we know from new data are that if you look at age-specific rates of mortality, that is death, it's the same in sub-Saharan Africa as it is in other parts of the world if you haven't been vaccinated. So again, very important. Vaccination does a remarkable thing. But lesson number 4 is that it may have been easy to produce 11.2 billion doses in a single year, but distributing those doses equitably was much more of a problem. Of course, the major companies made a huge amount of money during 2022. $42 billion at Pfizer. This gets to a point that I remember our preventive medicine professor in medical school taught us, which is that vaccines don't save lives, vaccination saves lives. And in 2021, the Tony Blair Institute was already saying, even if we have 11.2 billion doses, how are we going to use that? What we are trying to do is vaccinate in places where vaccines are given to children. 80% of children receive all the childhood vaccinations recommended by WHO, the core of childhood vaccination. 80%, not a bad number, a significant increase since the year 2000, and a real accomplishment by WHO, Gavi, and other organizations. But these are distributing vaccines to the birth cohort, that is, the children who are born every year, about 130 million a year globally. Now we have to vaccinate 7 billion people, and how are healthcare systems that are struggling at best going to vaccinate everyone in the population? And so you can see some of the issues that occur there. If you look at the healthcare quality index from the Lancet in 2016, you can see that there's a real gap in a certain part of the world. And what part of the world did not distribute COVID vaccines? And there is a correspondence between healthcare systems that need to be strengthened and lack of COVID vaccination. So lesson number 5, impact is about delivery. So, and I think a number of us are outraged by the fact that we couldn't distribute vaccine in Africa in a timely manner. But I think that when we take a step back, we have to realize that inequity in access is something that we've chosen to live with over time. And so this is the Global Vaccine Action Plan target, 90% coverage for these different childhood vaccines, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. This is the first dose, this is the third dose, hepatitis B, Haemophilus influenza. And so you can see that at a time in 1980, when coverage in the US for standard DTP was 85 to 90%, the rest of the world was at 40%, and particularly low in low and middle income countries. Now, we've made a tremendous change here. But take a look at a more recently introduced vaccine, a vaccine against rotavirus. It was approved in the US in 2007. It was recommended by WHO in 2009. It was actually approved by WHO in 2009 for use around the world. And today, 15 years after the initial approval, 60% of the world's children do not receive rotavirus vaccine. Inequity is something we have chosen to live with. So really the idea that we were able to vaccinate 70% of the world's population in a year, or 70% of the world's population received at least a single dose of COVID-19 vaccine, is a remarkable thing. But there was still an inequity in the accessibility or in the access to the vaccine, particularly in low-income countries, also a big problem in lower middle income countries. So those countries that have just crossed over the boundary between low income and middle income. But COVID isn't the only disease that and certainly not the only pandemic disease that we can take lessons from. So I think many of you may never have heard of smallpox, and many of you have never been vaccinated against smallpox. I have twice, but smallpox was a major disease. The World Health Assembly rejected smallpox eradication. Now, we've had an effective smallpox vaccine since 1797. And but here in 1966 or 1965, the World Health Organization was still debating whether or not we should use that vaccine to try to wipe smallpox out, to eliminate it or eradicate it from the world. And finally, the US and Russia agreed in the World Health Assembly, so the WHO, to set aside $2.4 million to push for smallpox eradication. Now, at that point, we had 10 to 15 million cases of smallpox a year, with 200,000 deaths a year from smallpox. Now, the vaccine is unusual. It is a highly effective vaccine. It's not based on smallpox itself. It's based on cowpox. And we had a way to deliver it. A new needle was introduced in 1968. By 1970, so 4 years later, 20 additional countries were smallpox-free. And by 6 years later, the last cases of smallpox were seen. So that by 1980, WHO could declare smallpox eradicated, gone. It exists maybe in 2 locations, in the CDC in Atlanta in the US and in a similar institute in Russia. It's thought that maybe other countries may have smallpox stocks, which is really rather dangerous. But it is really a victory for total eradication of a disease using vaccination as the tool. But there are some lessons here. So, I remember COVID, and wherever COVID came from, it was from bats or raccoon dogs or whatever organism transmitted those infections to humans. Zoonotic transmission is always looked upon as a bad thing. Well, in this case, zoonotic transmission was not necessarily a bad thing, because William Jenner, in 1797, made use of an observation, and which was that milkmaids, the women who were collecting milk from cows, didn't acquire smallpox. They were somehow protected. They did acquire something called the cowpox, which you get from the udder of a cow and causes these lesions on the hand, is non-fatal, and protects you from smallpox. So cowpox, he reasoned, was protecting people against smallpox, and that was the basis for the first effective vaccine against smallpox. So this was a beneficial zoonotic transmission. Now, again, in the line of smallpox, we know about mpox, or what used to be called monkeypox, which is a very highly related virus that causes a disease that can be fatal, again, that can be protected by the vaccine derived from cowpox. So again, really kind of interesting lessons in the way zoonotic transmissions can protect us without hurting us, or in the case of mpox, can be retransmitted in populations that aren't immune to smallpox, because we no longer use the smallpox vaccine in general. So lesson number 7. Neither wars, hot or cold, prevented vaccine use and eradication. So remember, Jenner introduced the vaccine in 1797. At that time, England was engaged in a life or death struggle with France. During the wars of the French Revolution and then the wars of the Napoleonic era, England and France were enemies in the worst way. Large armies, blockades, naval battles, and all these things were preventing England and France from working together on anything. But at that time, cowpox vaccine or smallpox vaccine was thought to be so important that it was taken across the English Channel from England to France, was used in vaccination campaigns in France in 1804. So remember, 1804 was the start of the next set of Napoleonic Wars. And this is a coin, and actually you can buy it on the internet, given to people who were vaccinating French citizens against smallpox. That's how important it was. This is actually the end of the Napoleonic Wars at Waterloo in 1814. But despite that, the vaccine made its way from England to France, and then from France to Spain, and from Spain, in a ship full of orphans, they were transmitting the cowpox virus from one orphan to another. These are orphan boys. And the ship made its way to Latin America, and then eventually around the Cape Horn to the Philippines, where smallpox vaccination was introduced at all of these sites. So again, during a war, we started to work and transmit vaccines for public good. Why? Because vaccines are important. Global health was more important than a hot war in the case of the Napoleonic Wars, or a Cold War. The eradication of smallpox occurred during the Cold War between the West and the Soviet bloc. A remarkable thing, and something to remember, because COVID-19 vaccines, rightly or well, probably wrongly, were used as tools for diplomacy, as a way to get into countries, and were used in the wrong way by certain people. So important to realize that global public health is important. And in the past, with smallpox, we didn't let a war or dysfunction between countries prevent the transmission of a very essential public health tool. So, lesson number 8. You can use a virus to fight a virus. And this goes back to the time before we had the cowpox vaccine, when people were still, smallpox was a deadly disease. Mortality was maybe 30% with variola major, 3% with variola minor, but smallpox killed millions of people. If you look at a graph of the number of deaths during different pandemics, the smallpox pandemic killed hundreds of millions of people. But if you look back in the 10th century, Chinese and Sanskrit texts, so the Indian texts, mention the use of variolation, which is the word that we use now. What they were doing was they're taking people with smallpox and scraping the skin lesions, and then introducing those skin lesions under the skin, or in the Chinese text, they talk about taking a scab, drying it, making it into a powder, and blowing it into someone's nose, or taking the clothes from a person who had smallpox and putting it on an uninfected person. That would transmit a lower dose of the virus and allow a person to develop immunity before the virus killed them. And it did occasionally kill them. There was a mortality associated with variolation. But when you think about the 30% mortality and the scarring caused by smallpox, many people were willing to accept that. It was introduced to Europe by Lady Mary Montagu. So she was the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, which is now Turkey. And she had a question. She asked one of her friends why none of the women who were wives of the Sultan didn't have smallpox scars. Because in those days, if you survived smallpox, you had this horrible scarring over your face. And she noticed that none of the women in the harem had smallpox. And she was told that, well, there's this technique that we use that takes smallpox, a small amount, and introduces it under the skin. And she was fascinated by that. And she thought, well, this could be very important, because at that time, smallpox was killing off the heads of Europe, kings and queens and dukes. And actually, we have a list on another page. And what happened then is this variolation technique, before we actually had the cowpox vaccine, 1797, was spreading throughout Europe and was introduced to North America by this man, Cotton Mather. So these are the number of deaths from smallpox in Boston, in the United States. In the year 1721, you can see 8,000 deaths from smallpox. Cotton Mather actually got the idea from a slave, one of his slaves, Onesimus, who was from West Africa, and said, we have a technique to prevent smallpox called variolation, and interestingly, he talked Dr. Boylston into using it. So here, the variolation was introduced. You can see the rates declined. And then in 1800, so 3 years after it was discovered, smallpox vaccine, the new smallpox vaccine was introduced, and you can see the number of deaths from smallpox drop off dramatically. So this is the mortality from smallpox, 30%, from variola minor. Severe facial scarring, 65 to 80% of people so you had this horrible scarring on your face. In the 20th century, smallpox itself killed 300 to 500 million people. So a real issue. So lesson number 9, it helps, that is uptake of a vaccine helps if the disease is worse than the prevention and potentially leaves scars on the face. So they were willing to accept the mortality from variolation, 1 to 2%, to avoid the mortality from variola major, 30%, and the severe facial scarring that accompanied it. But they didn't do it just because Lady Montagu observed it in Turkey. She actually tested it. So the Princess of Wales then, this was not conducted in the modern way with consent and ethical committees. They tested it on prisoners and abandoned children. They were inoculated, they were variolated, and then they were deliberately exposed to smallpox. So this was a human challenge experiment, and they were protected. So the Princess of Wales used her influence and to introduce variolation in the or at that point it was called Great Britain, and it became much more common in Europe. And if you look again, you can find countries like Russia actually gave medals to people for the introduction of this. Why? Because in the 18th century, these are kings and queens and heads of state who died of smallpox. And you can see it wasn't only in Europe where people died of smallpox. And in fact, there's actually a story from the Yuan dynasty of China that they didn't pick the oldest son of the emperor. They picked one of the sons who had had smallpox as the emperor. Why? Because that person would live and not die of smallpox. So they actually made a dynastic decision based on who had smallpox and survived and who hadn't had smallpox. So again, a very important development in the history of vaccines. Lesson number 10, quality matters. So in the modern day, one of the things that distinguishes manufacturing of vaccines in Korea from manufacturing of vaccines that occurs in some other countries is an extraordinary attention to quality. Why? Because we want a vaccine to work the same way over and over again. So if we have a vaccine that is 80% efficacious, we don't want the next batch of it to be 60% or 20% efficacious. We want there to be a high level of quality and reproducibility, but also if you don't make the vaccine right and something bad happens, no one is going to use the vaccine. So quality matters both from the perspective of reproducibility, but also from the perspective of safety. Well, imagine now in 1797, or, as they were sending those orphan boys around the Cape Horn, transmitting cowpox one to the other in order to have someone who had an active lesion that could be used in the Philippines. There were no quality controls at that time. And as we went from the original cowpox, this is a vaccination, at some point, at least in the United States, we switched from cowpox to horsepox. So this is a modern sample. They looked at a sample of a smallpox vaccine from 1910. And what they found was, when they sequenced it, that it was not called cowpox anymore, it was horsepox. And so the eradication of smallpox was not actually due to a cowpox-based vaccine, but potentially from a horsepox vaccine. And again, so this gets to the idea. Quality is very important. And in modern vaccine manufacturing, it is critical. It is what the MFDS will look at, Ministry of Food and Drug Safety will look at over and over again. But in this case, quality didn't matter. So, lesson 11, sometimes it pays to ignore politicians. So this gets to, Korea was really lucky in that the government paid attention to the science. That was not always the case in all countries around the world. And I think we don't have to name names. But there's a lesson from smallpox here as well. In 1776, so those of you who are familiar with American history know that the Declaration of Independence was July 4th, 1776, and the US Continental Congress, which was the government at the time, banned the use of variolation, that is the introduction of small amounts of smallpox in order to prevent the big disease. In George Washington's Continental Army, so again, George Washington was the general in command of the Continental Army, 90% of the deaths were not from the British, against whom they were fighting, but from diseases, and the majority of the cases was smallpox. In fact, it was so bad that the governors of states were telling him, we're not going to send soldiers to you because no one wants to die of smallpox. The British, on the other hand, because Britain had a significant amount of smallpox exposure naturally, were immune. Whereas in the United States, which was separated by almost 3,000 miles of ocean from Europe, had very low rates of smallpox infection. So people were very susceptible, and 30% of them died. So on the 6th of February, 1777, against the instructions from Congress, Washington vaccinated or variolated his army. And that protected them from infection and death. And in the end, Washington won. And this is the surrender of the British at Yorktown in 1781. Sometimes it pays to ignore politicians who are not following the science. So lesson number 12, and again, this is a lesson that we need to apply in COVID. Misinformation and violence should not prevent our use of vaccines. So remember Cotton Mather. Now, he had a really checkered history in America. He actually was a part of the witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts. But because he had tried to push this variolation, people were very, very violently sometimes opposed to him. In fact, someone threw a bomb into his front window trying to kill him. So COVID isn't the only time when vaccination was violently opposed. Then there was a misinformation around the use of the cowpox vaccine. So once Jenner introduced the cowpox vaccine for vaccination, there were significant concerns, and you can see a cartoon here, a very famous cartoon, a famous cartoonist. This is the doctor doing vaccination, and you can see cows emerging from the places where a person has been vaccinated. And there was some thought that vaccination caused people to look like cows. So you can see the person with horns here. You can see the boy who was born with a face that looked like a cow. Again, complete misinformation. And despite all of this, we were able to eradicate smallpox now almost 200 years after the vaccine was introduced. So, but smallpox isn't the only pandemic that we can learn from. We've had an ongoing pandemic from cholera going on since 1961. So that would be 63 years of cholera pandemic, the 7th global cholera pandemic. We know that water, sanitation, and hygiene, improving the quality of water, providing good sanitation and good hygiene are a definitive solution to prevent cholera. So you don't see cholera in Korea anymore. Although, if you go back to the turn of the 19th century, there are descriptions of, massive cholera outbreaks and death in Korea. But improvements in the water supply and chlorination and good sanitation and getting rid of human waste in a clean and effective way really do prevent some of these diarrheal diseases. But the problem is that 3 billion people and 2 out of 5 healthcare facilities lack adequate access to hand hygiene. WHO estimates that 1.4 million lives each year are lost due to inadequate water, sanitation, and hygiene. So you'd say, well, who needs to vaccinate? We could just improve water, sanitation, and hygiene. Well, that's not such an easy thing. UNESCO estimated in 2017 that to bring the level of water, sanitation, and hygiene up to the point where we would no longer be threatened by waterborne diseases would cost $114 billion a year, primarily in countries where that kind of money is not available. So water, sanitation, and hygiene would be great, but we could be waiting a long time before economic development reaches the stage where we can control the diseases more easily. But we do have a vaccine. So IVI has an oral cholera vaccine. Now, efficacy of that vaccine is between 50 and 60%. So I think those of you, everyone will remember the COVID vaccines were between 80 and 90% efficacious. And, look at the problems that we had with the COVID vaccines, and people continued to have disease. Although the cholera vaccine is only 50% efficacious, when you vaccinate 80% of an Indian city, sorry, when you vaccinate 50% of the people in an Indian city, you have effectiveness of the vaccine of 80%. So there's an 80% drop in the number of cases. So vaccinate 50% of the city, 80% drop in cholera cases, which is really what you want to see. That is the herd effect, herd immunity. We talked about it all the time during COVID. We never really saw it. Why? Because the diseases are very different. But with cholera, you were able, with a vaccine that was only 50% efficacious, to achieve 80% effectiveness with mass vaccination, and not 90% not 90% vaccination as we did in Korea during COVID, but with 50%. So again, every disease is slightly different. So these are the reported effectiveness of a vaccine with efficacy between 50 and 60%. Some lessons from HIV. Now, my career started in HIV, so I'm always partial to this. But HIV has some really important lessons as we think about pandemics in the future. So lesson 14, sometimes it's the virus. So, in a way, we were very lucky with COVID. I know no one thinks that, but it was relatively easy to develop a vaccine against COVID. For HIV, the virus was discovered in 1984. Or 1985, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services stood up there, Margaret Heckler, with Robert Gallo, who discovered the virus in the US, and said, in 2 years, we will have a vaccine. So this would have been 1987 or 88. And here in 2024, we still don't have a vaccine. In 1993, Bill Clinton announced the Manhattan Project for AIDS. So Manhattan Project was the project that developed the atomic bomb during World War II. We've done a number of phase 3 trials for HIV. The US government alone spends $600 to $700 million a year to develop an HIV vaccine. So think about 30 years of funding at $500 million a year. We've spent billions trying to develop a vaccine against HIV. Nothing. Why? The virus is very different. The transmission is different, and the virus itself makes it more difficult because of the cells that the virus infects, and the places in the body where the virus remains latent. But lesson number 15 is that it's only really a failure if you don't learn from it. So these are the trials. And after the failure of the initial set of VaxGen trials, GP140C, conformational, was invented. So the original set of spike proteins were just made, and they weren't made in a way that would induce the correct immune responses. So we started to develop these conformational antigens that were then used in these trials, which also failed. Now we're looking at stabilized pre- and post-fusion trimers. Again, work that was that informed COVID vaccine development. That is, what we knew about HIV structure and the structure of the trimers were used. And actually, the second IVI award this year is being given to the two scientists who helped to discover that for HIV, initially for RSV that informed HIV, that informed COVID, was the use of conformationally correct post-fusion trimers, which we're now in the process of testing. So all of this work informed the development of the RSV vaccine and the SARS-CoV pre-fusion and post-fusion spikes. Again, really important that we learn from our failures. And that's what science is about. Lesson number 16, never look a gift horse in the mouth. Why? A lot of the trials that were conducted in the United States, and actually some of the trials that were conducted in Africa, were conducted in networks that were set up for HIV vaccines. Scientists who worked on HIV vaccines and did sequencing rapidly transitioned to sequencing of COVID vaccines. The laboratory in Africa that discovered the alpha, beta, and Omicron strains at a laboratory in Africa were set up to do HIV sequencing. So that capability allowed the lab to rapidly transition to sequencing the new pathogen, in this case, COVID-19, and they were instrumental in discovering these different strains. Again, a benefit of the amount of money that was invested in HIV research. Then, of course, the structure of the proteins, the biostatistical centers around the world, the experience with large multi-center trials, much of it was lent to the US government from the groups that were doing HIV vaccine research. So 2 decades of HIV vaccine research contributed to the successful development of COVID-19 vaccines. So this is kind of near the end. If it seems to you that I talk about a pandemic like a war, in a way it is, right? It's a war against the virus. It's a war where we're under the gun. We have to get something done quickly. So these are some famous generals and political leaders. This is Douglas MacArthur. Prior preparation, so he said preparedness is the key to success and victory. And if you look at the success of the Korean government in the COVID-19, particularly early in the COVID-19 pandemic, it learned from the influenza pandemic in 2010 and from the MERS epidemic in 2015, so that Korea was among the best prepared of countries from a governmental perspective on how we handle an outbreak. So another statement from a former Secretary of State: prior preparation prevents poor performance. But again, it gets to this original statement by Douglas MacArthur. Omar Bradley was the general who led the invasion at Normandy in World War II. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. So this is really important because, again, we could make 11 billion doses of vaccine. If we don't get it to Africa, and if we don't get it into the arms of the people who need it, then we're not protecting anybody. Logistics it's easy to talk about strategy. It's much more difficult to actually deliver the product where you need it, when you need it. So the next one is from a former French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau. Generals prepare for the last war, especially if they've won it. So this gets to, in 2018, an assessment found the US, the United States, the best nation for a pandemic in the future. And what happened? Over 1 million Americans died during COVID. You can't fight the last war. You can't imagine that the current pandemic, in this case it was COVID, was going to be like influenza, which was what the US was prepared for. So you need to think about what the potential pathogens could be in the future and anticipate and prepare with that anticipation in mind. So Helmut von Moltke wasn't involved in World War I. He actually was involved in planning the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, but he was a strategist, and he said, no plan of operations reaches with any certainty beyond the first encounter with the enemy, which was then simplified that no plan survives contact with the enemy. So a government, so in this case, the Pandemic Response Unit in the Korean government, had to look at data as it emerged. Deborah Birx, who led the US COVID pandemic response from the White House, from the Trump White House, had to go to Korea and Spain and Italy to get data to help model the pandemic in the United States, the epidemic outbreak in the United States, because they didn't have data. And you need to look at the data and use those data to change your policy if that's needed. So the Korean government, when it saw that Omicron was spreading in vaccinated populations, knew that it needed to make sure that 95% of the population was vaccinated. So again, and then they removed some of the pandemic restrictions and let Omicron happen. But you have to be able to look at the emerging situation, understand the data, understand what you have, and make decisions based on your best decision. May not always be the right one, based on those data. So the importance of being able to restructure a plan in order to achieve the control that you need. The next one comes from a person, I put a big X in him, not because he didn't say it, but because Nathan Bedford Forrest was a racist and fought for the Southern side in the Civil War, then led the Ku Klux Klan. So not necessarily a good person. But he said, get there first with the most. And this is what pandemic response is. You know that the pandemic is occurring, you need to respond quickly, which in the case of Korea meant tracking and tracing, diagnostic kits, gloves, masks, gowns, monoclonal antibodies, vaccines. Speed matters in a pandemic. And we forget this. One of my favorite neurologists once told me this about epilepsy: fire burns. So you have to You have to prevent epilepsy from happening, or you have to stop the fit. Otherwise, there are consequences that dealing with later are more difficult. Well, the same thing is true of pandemics. We have to respond quickly. The final thing comes from a Greek strategist, Archilochus. He said, if we don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. Training is the key. So it wasn't enough for Korea to have pandemic plans, but it was important for the Korean government and Korean universities to participate in pandemic exercises. Why? Because it's getting used to the system. It's understanding what the issues are. It's working through them in practice, in training, that will make a pandemic response effective. So again, really important things. So these are the 16 lessons. Crisis spurs innovation. Funding realizes innovation. We can scale to billions of doses of vaccine, but access and equity are harder to realize. Impact is about delivery. Zoonotic transmission is not always bad, but we should be alert to it. Wars should not prevent us. Wars or political disagreements between countries should not prevent us from allowing important global health technology to cross borders and save lives. You can use a virus to fight a virus. Number 9, it helps if the disease is worse than the prevention because that increases uptake of the vaccine. Number 10, quality matters. Number 11, sometimes it pays to ignore politicians. Number 12, misinformation and violence should not prevent us from vaccinating. Number 13, a vaccine does not need to be perfect to help. Number 14, sometimes the virus is as important as the pathogen. Sometimes the virus matters when it comes time to developing a vaccine. So science and funding for science are critical. Number 15, it's only a failure if you don't learn from it. And number 16, never look a gift horse in the mouth. So just a quick reminder, these are the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. If we take good health and well-being, which is what most of us are concerned about, this is number 3, you can map all the other things like low poverty, quality education, gender equality onto this good health. And because I can't ever remember what the numbers are, this gives you an idea. And you can see, I mean, this is good health. Well, a family that has a measles infection that keeps the mom out of work for a period of time, say 3 weeks, keeps them in poverty for 9 months. So vaccination and good health really are key to other parts of the sustainable development ecosystem. Finally, let's not ever separate global health from our other problems. We can't just say all we're concerned about is global health, because really everything is related. So if you look at the major challenges to mankind in society and the planet, so this includes AMR, climate change, species diversity or the biosphere, and pollution, population growth, which puts pressure on lots of different things, scarcity, which may be related to population growth, and then conflict, they're all related, and global health intersects with all of them. So to think that we can separate one from the other is difficult. And these are just examples. Deforestation in the Amazon, which is a planetary issue and a societal issue, definitely brings people in closer contact with animals. And that allows for efficient transmission of zoonotic diseases to humans, which eventually leads to something like COVID. And population and scarcity, again, very closely related. This is a typical Malthusian argument from the 18th century. If the population goes up too much, there's going to be competition for scarce resources. And here you see, oops, get rid of this. Here you see a drought in Somalia, so a planetary issue causing famine. Refugees, so internal and external displacement of people within Somalia, followed by an outbreak of cholera, then an outbreak of measles. So you can see the intersection between these two and a global health problem. In Goma, in Rwanda, during the genocide of Hutus, the Hutus against the Tutsis in Rwanda, large numbers of refugees went to the Democratic Republic of Congo. I guess then it was Zaire. In 1994, there was a massive outbreak of cholera that killed tens of thousands of people. A conflict leading to external displacement of refugees, followed by cholera outbreak and tens of thousands of deaths. And then, of course, conflict between in societies themselves. This is in Italy. protesting the use of these cards, green pass cards that allowed you, that proved that you were vaccinated. If you wanted to go to the supermarket or to a bar or a restaurant, you had to show the card. People were, of course, protesting. So again, the intersection between all of these impacts global health, and it's important as you think about this, and being a part of the Futures Institute, you are thinking about this. All of these problems are interrelated. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions or participate in discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, for your wonderful lecture. Now let's move on to the discussion. Joining us as the designated discussant today is Dr. Eun-Hwa Choi, a professor of pediatrics at SNU College of Medicine, the director of Children's Hospital at SNUH, and the chief of Korean Expert Committee on Immunization Practices. Dr. Choi, please share your perspective.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, JJ. And it is my great honor to follow Jerome's lecture and the opportunity to discuss about the lessons from pandemic vaccine development, especially in the Korean perspective. So the infectious disease emergence involves two main steps. An agent is introduced into a new host population, and also the agent is established and transmitted within the new host population. So this is the global map presented, shows newly emerging infectious disease and notable disease outbreaks in humans since 2003. It underscores the multitude of emerging threats observed worldwide, with multiple outbreaks occurring in new areas. Of particular concern in our country, Korea, the persistence of SFTS since 2012 along the recent global outbreaks. Since 2015, the WHO has implemented a comprehensive global research strategy and preparedness plan known as the WHO R&D Blueprint for Epidemics. Since November 2022, a new approach has been implemented focusing on entire classes of viruses or bacterial family rather than individual pathogens. So pathogen X or disease X are a known pathogen with the potential to trigger a severe global epidemic. So this new family approach will also help identify representative virus, which is called a prototype within a viral family, as a pathfinder in generating evidence and filling knowledge gaps that may then apply to other viruses of threat in the same family. So to effectively develop vaccines against new emerging infectious diseases, we begin with robust research and development, which is supported by sound scientific principles and adequate funding. And this is followed by preclinical and clinical trials, which involve meticulous study design and also the sufficient trial site capacity and large scale manufacturing, and obtaining emergency use authorization for clinical use is crucial for timely and also optimal implementation of the vaccines. As demonstrated during the use of COVID-19 vaccine, especially in Korea, the addressing misinformation and inequity and vaccine hesitancy is a crucial step in the progress. So during the COVID-19 pandemic in Korea, our funding for vaccine R&D in Korea was primarily directed for the development mRNA vaccines. This focused approach enabled a comprehensive assessment of the infrastructure and raw material supply, and also manpower, regulations, and licensing issues pertinent to the swift development of mRNA vaccines in the anticipation of future unknown pandemics. So there are two approaches for now for global R&D for infectious diseases that emerged during the COVID-19 pandemic. One is, which is shown by CEPI and WHO in 2021, they introduced a new paradigm for vaccine development for outbreak response. And this approach emphasizes readiness and rapid reaction time and a streamlined rollout and review process. A key aspect in achieving rapid reaction time of 100 days between the outbreak and the available use for the new vaccines. This 100 days mission has been adopted in many countries through international collaboration. Another approach you already heard about ALPA-H, which is proposed in the US 2022. And this new initiative aims to accelerate biotechnology and innovation and boost America's bioeconomy across the various sectors, including health, agriculture, and energy. So the ALPA-H is not just limited to infectious diseases alone. It covers a broader scope of health. And as an organization within NIH, the ALPA-H is very crucial to collaborate with other key agencies such as CDC, FDA, and BARDA under the Department of Health and Human Services in the US. For infectious diseases, examples for the potential project in the US also include the ability to design, test, and approve a vaccine against any newly emerging human virus within 100 days. So our nation, Korean government, quickly integrated these two concepts into the proposed Korean ALPA-H. And this is currently at the initial planning stages, and the MOH will allocate funding for the primary mission of the Korean ALPA-H, ensuring health security through the development of vaccines and therapeutics. The 50-year goal is to develop and produce the vaccine within 10 days of an outbreak, and also the 10th year goal is to establish rapid diagnosis in just 5 minutes. So one of the key takeaways from Jerome's talk was that vaccine doesn't save lives and vaccination saves lives. So throughout the pandemic, especially in Korea, we also learned the lessons about that. So when I talk about the vaccine hesitancy, I often emphasize that vaccine hesitance is not just a binary phenomenon. It is a continuum from advocating, accepting, and hesitant, and refusing. So when we communicate with these barriers, we have to effectively managing this information by accepting where these people is standing. And very important, these people might shift their placement by misinformations. When addressing misinformation, especially digital platforms, this is the principle how we deal with the misinformation. The message should start with a fact, not just fallacy. When we start with the fallacy, it is difficult to address the fact itself. One should explain why this information is wrong or incorrect. By that, we can emphasize the hidden motive of misinformation, so it can be disseminated and propagated. So it is very important to address the fact in the beginning and at the end of your conversation and communication. So with that, my discussion is ended, and I'm happy to answer or discuss with Jerome and our participant. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for your insightful discussion. So the picture here is really, really bad. Impressive. And stressing the importance of visualization. Thank you. So now the floor is open for comment, suggestions, and questions. Please go on. So let me start asking Dr. Kim about the role of COVAX. So do you hear me?
Yes, I do. Sorry,
Okay.
I'm on mute. They're cleaning my room, but I think we can speak.
Okay. So my question to you is, what role do you think the COVAX played throughout the COVID-19 pandemic? So more specifically, how many people were vaccinated through COVAX? And do you believe its effort was sufficient?
The role of COVAX had intended to vaccinate 50% of the people who needed to be vaccinated by the end of the first year. So that was by the end of 2021. And it fell a bit short in terms of the number of doses that were shipped, on the one hand. On the other hand, it was an unprecedented first attempt to distribute vaccine around the world, something we'd never done in the first year of introduction. So remember, I talked about rotavirus vaccine, how 50%, 60% of the world's children have not been vaccinated. HPV, human papillomavirus vaccine, 80% have not been vaccinated. And we've had these technologies for 15 years. So for COVAX to ship that much was remarkable. It was developed in an emergency, so it didn't work perfectly. But this is a mechanism that we should fix, not a mechanism that we should throw away. And because, you know, as we introduce the new respiratory syncytial virus vaccines or others, we should really be thinking about how we provide access to these new technologies quickly for the rest of the world. And if it means, you know, that Pfizer or Moderna will be distributing their vaccines through networks that were set up during COVID, I think that's a great thing. So, you know, maybe the pandemic treaty will begin to address this question, but COVAX really didn't work perfectly. But considering it was set up, when it was set up and the pressures that they were under, it was really a remarkable undertaking. And again, you know, remember that preparation really helps. So this is our time to prepare for the next pandemic.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Okay, go on.
Thank you for the very enriching presentation today. It was very interesting to learn about the fact that the centers in Africa, which were previously dedicated to HIV, were able to refocus towards COVID-19. What measures, in your opinion, should be prioritized in these underdeveloped nations to promote their readiness and expedite their response to future pandemics, other than just waiting for vaccine delivery? And my second question is kind of related to this. It's and in this aspect, what are the roles of more developed countries and other industrial parties in supporting this vaccine equity?
Oh, that's a great question. And that's why I'm here in Rwanda today. So I think that the first and probably the most important thing is strengthening of health systems. So, you know, the ability to deliver healthcare was critical. And, you know, in many parts of Africa, and, you know, we didn't even know the pandemic was here at a point where Kenya was reporting 10,000 cases of COVID. When you did a serosurvey in blood bank samples, you know, there were 300,000 infections that would have been extrapolated from blood bank data. So, you know, healthcare systems, delivery, diagnosis, all these are part of the initial pandemic response. But also, as outbreaks occur, we need to be able to monitor them in real time, so that the Kenyan or Rwandan equivalent of the Center for Disease Control, the KDCA, sorry, the Korea Disease Control Agency, needs to be strengthened also, so that they're A, aware, B, if they're aware, they can treat, C, and they can report, and then they can tell us, you know, give us information about what pathogen it is that's affecting them. So we were in Ethiopia last week, and they were telling us there's a chikungunya outbreak in southern Ethiopia. And we've heard from people in Kenya that actually mortality is very high in infants. There are cases of neurological disease from chikungunya, which had never really been reported before, but now that Kenya has reported, it's being reported in South America as well. So again, I think low and middle income countries have a critical role as places where diseases occur that we can find out about. It's important that they have strong healthcare systems, and then, you know, they didn't have access to vaccines or therapeutics. So what we're doing now is to help to strengthen vaccine manufacturing, so that regional vaccine manufacturing, not manufacturing of vaccines in every single country, 54 countries in Africa is a reality, but to have strong enough regional manufacturing and agreements in place so that if there is a pandemic, the technology for manufacturing vaccines can be transferred to that vaccine manufacturing plant, and Africa will actually now begin to have its own ability to supply vaccines in the way the Korean companies contributed to the COVID response, SK among them, to manufacture either the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Novavax vaccine, or then its own vaccine. So having a robust vaccine research and development capability and sustainable manufacturing could be an important part of a solution for Africa and other so Latin America is thinking the same thing, but they're starting from a slightly different place. I think finally the pandemic treaty, this is an agreement between countries of the world on how to take care of the next pandemic, may allow us then to have much more coordination and may allow us, again, hard to know yet, because not all the countries have signed on, to have a much better form of COVAX that will actually do the things that we wanted COVAX to do in the first place.
Thank you very much.
Maybe I can add to Jerome Kim to the question from Jisoo Kim. So we really have to understand their geographics and also the people's lifestyle, because there are so many rural areas and so many islands that we cannot access to them, and then also their lifestyle is not so. We are not familiar with their lifestyles, and then also especially COVID-19 vaccine, that we have to be very, very stringent storage conditions to keep it safe and effective. So that was another hurdle we have.
Good. So I have a question to Dr. Euna Choi. So my question is, why do you think Korea, our country, did not play a major role in the development of COVID-19 vaccines? We are investing a lot actually for R&D, and we are well industrialized and we are well developed. Why our devotion in terms of development of COVID-19 vaccine is not that big?
So maybe I could say that that's not satisfying our expectation, but we can say that Korea is one of the countries that successfully developed COVID-19 vaccine for clinical use. But as Jerome mentioned, the speed was mattered. So the production was kind of a little bit behind the timeline. But usually the vaccine development typically requires long-term planning and then extensive testing. But mRNA vaccine in Korea, we are very minimal research mRNA vaccine, and also the domestic investment and manufacturing, we are not ready for that. So, but now probably we'll do. We contribute more than we was before. Okay.
Thank you. Dr. Kim, do you have any comment?
Yes, it's actually to endorse what Professor Choi has said. I think, and this gets to the amount of funding that is available for vaccine and therapeutics development early on in the pandemic. The ARPA-H might theoretically provide that kind of upfront, I call it a bolus of funding, that a company needs in order to justify working on a pandemic pathogen for which it doesn't know, so if you're a company, you think about a market and you develop a vaccine to fill a market, the vaccine can be sold for X price. In a pandemic, the government is telling a company, you need to develop a vaccine, and the company is saying, well, I'm going to develop it, but will there be any benefit for the company to develop it? And what the Operation Warp Speed and some of the other programs did was they said, we want you to develop the vaccine and we'll buy X number of doses. And that reassured the companies that they would actually not lose money, as they did during Ebola, developing a vaccine, stopping work on other things. And so this represents a new way to look at vaccines. And it really is important because, and we saw this in monoclonal antibodies. Korea has maybe what is the largest or the second largest manufacturer of monoclonal antibodies in the world. There was one Korean monoclonal antibody, developed from a company here. And so, you know, but again, the same idea needs to apply to therapeutics as we apply to vaccines. If we want to participate, then, you know, and now Korea is a part of CEPI formally, so it can access CEPI funding as well. And in fact, I think SK Bioscience is now a CEPI key manufacturing partner, which means that if something comes up, CEPI could do for SK what it did for AstraZeneca, which is to provide additional funding upfront to let SK drive forward as quickly as possible. So again, there are some improvements in it. I think, as Professor Che noted, with the R&D hubs, with the emphasis on mRNA, and with investments in manufacturing, Korea has the potential to play a much bigger role in the next pandemic, and actually for provision of high quality vaccines globally now as well.
Thank you. I hope so. So we now have time for one or two more questions.
Yes, I'd like to ask Dr. Kim a few questions on the topic of vaccine inequity. So you touched upon a lot of topics, like including differences in manufacturing or logistics capabilities. There's also diplomatic issues and misinformation. So I was wondering, what do you think was the biggest cause of vaccine delivery inequity in Africa during COVID? And my second question is, do you anticipate any new challenges in delivering vaccines for disease X or other currently emerging diseases?
So I can answer your last question first. I don't think we've made it as much progress as we want in the time since the pandemic. And interest is dropping off. There's a fantastic graph. I didn't show it, but it has the rise of cases of a disease, television and news reports, politicians saying we need a vaccine, and then a drop off in the number of cases, and then the drop off in television and news reports, the drop off in political interest, and then you have no vaccine and no support for the vaccines that were developed. And this is what happened during Ebola. And I don't think we've made progress, and we're already starting to see drop off in interest. So the pattern is repeating itself, and that's a major problem. There were two stages of the pandemic. Initially, so this is to deal with your first question. Initially, it was that most of the doses that were being manufactured were being used in the countries that had a capacity to pay for them up front. So I think you may recall that Korea joined COVAX, but its COVAX doses weren't going to come until June or July of 2021. Now, this is a country that is manufacturing COVID vaccines, but COVAX had a timetable of delivery for different countries. And then Korea asked Pfizer for some doses, and Pfizer said, well, then you have to get in line. And the line was June to July of 2021. So the ability to make upfront purchases at risk allowed certain countries like the United States and the European Union to be first in line to get vaccines. Now, could there be a mechanism that, say, I'm just picking a number, 10% of those vaccines could be reserved for low and middle income countries, for the most pressing, to vaccinate the key populations, healthcare workers, or the elderly? And you could do that. And actually, Sweden actually proposed doing that, but in reality, they used the vaccine first for Swedes. And to some extent, I guess I understand, almost all countries have a vaccine sovereignty law that allows them in emergency to take the vaccine first. So unfortunately, the Indian government took vaccine that Serum Institute had made. This is the AstraZeneca vaccine, took it. It was supposed to go to COVAX, but at that point, they reckoned that India's needs were so great that India deserved priority. So we need laws that allow, during a pandemic, for there to be equitable distribution despite these national laws. And the pandemic treaty doesn't necessarily address this well enough. So that's something that we really, again, need to work on. But interest is flagging. And to convince the United States, which in 2010 told Korea, well, that influenza vaccine that you bought, it isn't yours. We can take it if we need it. So, Korea started this process of developing its vaccine manufacturing as a result of that. But not every country in the world is like Korea and has the capability to do that. And so I think that's why we need treaties and laws and international discussion before the pandemic, the next pandemic. Anyway, a great question.
Thank you for your answer.
Okay, thank you. So time is running up, and is there any short question or comment from the floor? Okay, so now let's wrap up the lecture and discussions. Thank you very much, especially Dr. Jerome Kim for your wonderful lecture, and Dr. Choi for your insightful discussions. 고맙습니다.